This is Brittany Blackwell, host of the Resilient Teacher Podcast, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network, along with this podcast. Each show on the network is independently owned, and the views expressed may not represent those of other podcasts. For the best education podcasts, visit edupodcastnetwork.com.
Michael McDowell has been a public educator for 18 years, from classroom teacher to superintendent. He is also an author. Our focus today is his excellent practical book, Rigor Redefined: 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. Awesome conversation. So much to learn and understand. Thanks for listening. Oh, by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you helped out the podcast. How can you do that? Here are 3 ways that you can help out the podcast. Number 1, tell a friend and share links. Number 2, go to my website and leave a review and subscribe. And number 3, click on the link on my website homepage to buy me a coffee. And by doing this, you could donate $1 or $2 to help me address the cost associated with producing the podcast. That's so cool. You are awesome. Enjoy the show.
And what I really liked about Surface, Deep, and Transfer, which really comes from the research from Biggs and Collins in the early 80s. And what they were doing is they were saying, look, let's just look at the complexity of a task and what's actually expected from students that we can observe. And they use this language of surface, deep, and transfer.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Milletto. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. With Dr. Steve Milletto.
Michael McDowell, EDD, was a public school educator for 18 years, serving in the roles of classroom teacher, academic and athletic coach, school principal, assistant superintendent of personnel and instruction, and superintendent. During his tenure as a superintendent, his school district received state and national accolades, including the National Blue Ribbon Award, which recognized their work for student performance and mental health and well-being in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic by the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. McDowell serves on educational boards, served as a college professor, and has worked for nonprofit organizations to enhance student learning around the world. Over the course of his career, Dr. McDowell has authored best-selling books, created professional learning programs and workbooks, provided keynotes and workshops, and provided practical tools and resources for thousands of teachers and leaders on almost every continent around the world. A prolific author and consultant, Dr. McDowell is recognized as one of the leading authorities on integrating innovative and impactful practices into schools. Dr. McDowell co-founded Hinge Education and offers keynotes and executive coaching to heads of school around the world, where he partners with educational leaders to implement high-leverage strategies that will enhance teaching and learning in classrooms, schools, and systems. Our focus today is Michael's book, Rigor Redefined: 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. Michael, thanks so much for being on the show, and say hi to everyone.
Hey, Steve, it's great to be with you. And hey, everybody, great to have this conversation. And I'm looking forward to being with you.
Well, it's great to have you here. You have an awesome book, and we're looking forward to delving into it. And, your book, Rigor Redefined: 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. In your introduction, you explain what rigorous learning is. So could you talk a little bit about what it isn't?
I appreciate that, Steve. One of the things that's really interesting is I was talking to some students a few years ago. Well, it's almost a decade now, where I was in New Zealand, and I kept talking to all of these students, and there was one student in particular that told me that, look, rigor isn't a hierarchy, it's a taxonomy. And I really had to step back from that. And the student said, they didn't call it Bloom's hierarchy, they called it Bloom's taxonomy. And it took me a while to really step back between, well, what is a taxonomy? What is a hierarchy? And when you look at Bloom's original writing, his original work, he really looked at these levels of complexity of learning and said, look, these are different categories, but it's not a hierarchy. But then he built that pyramid. We lost our minds. We're like, oh, you have to do this, then you have to do this, you have to do this. But really learning isn't, learning a specific fact and then being able to apply. It's actually a mixture of all of those. And so one of the things I wanted to do in this book is to talk about how rigor has to be tied to how we actually learn. We don't learn how to ride a bike by learning all the parts of the bike first. Sometimes we go right into application, and then we'll come back and we'll actually talk about what do these particular parts of the bike mean, and what they represent. And so for me, I went into this work around how to rethink about rigor because of how I talk to kids and what students were saying to me about their own learning. And so that shift, and then going back and reading these original notes around rigor, really helped me understand that it's about a balance across different levels of complexity, and that it really shouldn't be viewed as this hierarchy.
Very cool. So, all right. So I got to go next to part of your title, because in your book, you introduce the reader to surface, deep, and transfer learning. Could you explain why these terms are important to understanding rigorous learning?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things for me. I think one, when you look at all of the different levels of Bloom's and you look at Webb's depth of knowledge and these different taxonomies, I think they're too complex. I think they're too complex for students to understand. First and foremost, for me, I think that's really important. I think the second is it's too complex for teachers. It's just so many different levels. And what I really liked about surface, deep, and transfer, which really comes from the research from Biggs and Collins in the early 80s. And what they were doing is they were saying, look, let's just look at the complexity of a task and what's actually expected from students that we can observe. And they used this language of surface, deep, and transfer. Surface, I know things. I know the different parts of the body, let's just say. Deep, I can relate the parts of the body. Transfer, I can apply the body into like a real world situation. Like we go into outer space, what's the strain on the body? Or we get sick because we get, some kind of bug. And that would be transfer. And so this idea that we have a simple taxonomy that has these three kind of categories, to me, I looked at that and I'm like, kids can make sense of that. I've seen it in schools. Teachers can make sense of that. We can communicate that out pretty well. And then the idea that they're all equally important and that you can start or end at any level. Like you could start at transfer, or you could start at surface, or you could start at deep. And so to me, the idea was that it's a simple taxonomy that you could use with a kindergartner, you could use with someone that's in graduate school. That to me is why that taxonomy was the one that I gravitated towards when I'm writing, as well as when I'm working with faculty or, administrators.
I like that because, some of... not to pick on any particular one, but some of them are pretty difficult to get into and really come to a simple understanding. And I like where you focused on surface, deep, and transfer, because what you just said, that is, we don't need AI, we don't need some massive tome or something like that to figure out what it means. Agreed. And if you look at what the research would say, so when you look at John Hattie's research, right, this visible learning work that looked at, thousands of studies, and they said, look, what makes the biggest impact on student learning? And I think that, number two is this idea of students being assessment capable, meaning they know where they're going, where they are, what's next. And so I think, well, okay, if we're going to help students be able to navigate their learning journey, let's give them like a pretty simple language set that they can use, because they also have to learn calculus. So I'd be like, oh, I'm at surface, or I'm at deep, or I'm at transfer. I just think that it's just a much more sound way to think about your learning, and it's simple. And then to me, I'm like, we don't have to make complexity any more complex. Love it. All right. So also what you focus on are 10 Rigor Redefined habits. So what are you talking about?
Well, one, I'm just a huge fan of habit science. And to me, it's because that's what education really is, right? To me, everything that we're trying to do in education is helping our students build habits to eventually know what to do when they don't know what to do, and to be able to have great character. And that to me is teaching students how to utilize small doable practices each and every day. And so if those are learning habits that we're trying to develop for students, well, what are our teaching habits? Because to me, when you think about things like deep learning and transfer learning, those can't be events. They can't be like, we're going to do a project in January, right? Like that, because then what we find is by the end of that, they're like, woo, the students are that great at projects. Maybe it's January. No, it's because they don't have the habits to actually be able to engage in that particular work. And so for me, it's what are habits that we could do on a daily basis that enable students to engage in surface, deep, and transfer level types of learning throughout a week, throughout their entire K-12 experience, because we find in the research, 90% of instruction is surface. 90% of students' task work is at surface level. And so what happens is students do all this surface work, and they often are assessed to deep, or they are assessed to transfer. And often when I talk with teachers, they say, well, that deep and transfer work just takes too much time. They treat them as these big events we have to design and implement. And so the work was really about, how do you make this habitual? How do you make this as something I can do 1% better each day, that's small and doable in my own classroom? And so for me, using and thinking through this from a habit science standpoint is where I think from a leadership standpoint, all change management really needs to be anchored to that. And that's really what we're trying to do as teachers. It's a practice, right? It's a practice-based profession. What are those habits that enable students to build that level of rigor?
Excellent. I love it. Now, I could spend the entire time I'm going to be talking to you on the introduction and chapter 1, but I'm not going to, because you've taken it put it in a nutshell for me, which is good, because that allows me to move forward a little bit. But I just want you to know that, as a historian, it's really hard for me to keep moving forward because there's a lot of stuff. So I love it. But I am going to move forward. And chapter 2 is titled Making Rigorous Learning Doable. I like this chapter a lot. All right. Especially because you're talking about, first of all, use the word doable. All right. That's cool. Because a lot of stuff in education is not that way. Especially you read it and you go, all right, let me go find the smarter guy over here to help me understand what the title said. This is pretty self-explanatory, and I love this. This is the second chapter to me that means that it needed to be addressed early on in the reader's journey. I hope that makes sense. I mean, you're saying this right off the bat almost, and that to me says that is important to say something about this. So why did you want to talk about how you're making it doable?
Well, Steve, you and I both have been administrators. We have been teachers. And often when we go into professional development, or we're in a PLC, or we talk with our staff, you think about like a professional development day, where like a really good one, right? Someone came in, they got the great jazz hands, great story. It's like, this is amazing. This is the best person ever. And then they leave. And then like a week later, like, anyone doing any of this? Like, nah, like we didn't get to it. Right.
Right.
And because And James Clear, who wrote this great book, Atomic Habits, and he talks about these two different types of habits that we have. We have motion and we have action. Motion is to preparing to do something. Like when I ask my son to clean his room and he like draws a map of cleaning his room, he's like, here's all the stuff I'm going to do, Dad, but doesn't clean it. And then there's action, which is like cleaning the room. It's like going to the gym. It's like taking that practice and giving it a go. And so much of our work, I think, has been designed around motion. We present the why, we present the what, we tell people these are all the things that you should be doing, and then we don't actually execute the how. And some books do it, but they talk about this at the end of the books. They're like, oh, and by the way, like change management's kind of an important part of this. It's like, well, it's actually the key to all of this kind of work. So it's setting the tone, I think, in the book to say, look, we don't see a lot of deep and transfer in classrooms. John Hattie said that looking at 17,000 classrooms, 0 examples of transfer. Right? It's absent in our schools. Deep learning, which is where standards sit, we only see a select few teachers that actually invest in those habits. Well, why is it? Is it because there's just so much resistance? I don't think so. I think it is because we have not found a way to make it small and doable where there's follow through. And when you look at research, like Rosenshine wrote this great article about effective direct instruction in 2012 for the American Federation of Teachers. And one of the things he said, look, everyone does guided practice, but it's the degree to which we do it that makes us experts. It's people who say, I'm going to do 1% more each day. I'm going to get a little bit better each day. So there's something really magical about in the power of, look, find a practice that's small and doable, do 1% each day, develop some level of familiarity for you and for students. And when you do that, you'll start to see the deep learning, the transfer learning come to fruition, but you have to make that small and doable. It's a key to any of this type of work. And I think it's also a breath of fresh air for leaders. So they never feel like, oh, I got to go do my Braveheart speech again and try to convince. It's like, instead of trying to convince people, let's just behave our way into it by 1% better tomorrow. And I think that was the key to that chapter.
Love it. And that is, and you bring back memories there too, by the way. That's, but that's good stuff. I knew it. I mean, it just, if you've ever been a teacher or an administrator, one of the things you want people to tell you is, you can put this in use. All right. This is something that I'm not just telling you about, wonderful things that are out there making you feel good or something like this. This is, you should be using it, and this is how you use it, and it's going to be possible, and everything's going to be good. And instead, I love the fact that this comes early on, because a lot of times, if you don't say something like that, the switch is turned off, and, you ever read the comic Calvin and Hobbes?
Yeah. Love Calvin and Hobbes.
Gotta love it. Calvin is off in space fighting aliens and stuff like that. And I've got to tell you that a lot of times that's going to be what the audience is doing if you're not connecting with them. So I love that. In Chapter 3, Developing Dispositional Habits, you introduce the reader to Habit 1, Engage Metacognition. What is this, and why is it important?
When we look at the visible learning work, and I'm just going to go back to the most substantial set of studies ever done was from John Hattie, who did visible learning, and he basically, what he did is he did a study of studies that studied studies. He's looked at over 750 million students, right, over the course of his career to compile what makes the most substantial difference. And one of the most powerful parts of this research is that students know essentially three things. They know where they're going in their learning, they know where they are, and they know what's next. And that of all of these studies, they said, look, if a student has that, they can think about that, and they have this wherewithal, what I would call a learning GPS. That's their ability to say, okay, so that's what I need to go and learn. So they're clear on what they're learning. They can assess where they are currently. They can get feedback to be able to move forward. That idea of can a student develop the habit of engaging in their own metacognition? Can they think about their own thinking? And that's a habit, right? That has to be nurtured and developed over time. And to me, that's habit number one, because it has such a powerful influence, and it enables students to know what to do when they don't know what to do, right? Like, so when I was superintending and when COVID hit, I didn't know what to do, but in that moment, I was like, okay, well, what do I know? Who can I call? Like, what frameworks can I reference, right? Like, there were things that I could start to think through, as opposed to just being frozen and being like, well, no one told me what to do. I guess I'm just going to have to wait. Like, there's no cavalry coming, right? And so those are the types of things that I think students need to nurture and develop. And that's why that habit is laid out. And the reason why that chapter, that dispositional chapter, is there, it's to say, look, there's a certain set of habits that help students become better learners. That does not mean that teaches them like how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, but it does enable them to actually have these strategies to understand where they are in adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, and what to do to actually get better in that work.
So this is awesome information, and I appreciate the way you've written the book, the way that you talk about the information and how it works within the classroom and such, and I love it, and I appreciate you explaining that. Now I'm going to go backwards for just a minute, because I wanted to go this far, but then I want to bring in something else, all right? And back in Chapter 1, I'm going to go back there. You say this: teaching students how to take action from feedback is critical. So tell me why.
So Steve, I can see the history teacher in you. Like, I can see where you're going. Like, you're like chronological, thematic. I mean, this is good stuff. Well, so feedback is this really powerful practice that we can use, right? And so, like, when you look at the research, it's like, wow, feedback can double the rate of learning. I think Dylan Williams said it in one of his first books on embedded formative assessment, and he coined the term formative assessment in his book, Inside the Black Box. He's like, this doubles the rate of learning. Well, it only doubles the rate of learning if students do something with it, right? And this is the difference between motion and action. I can give all the feedback in the world. Like, I can imagine, Steve, you spent evenings, weekends, grading, giving marks and great comments on students' work. I'm sure it was amazing. And then you gave it back to the students, and the students didn't action that. The students saw it and put it into their like trapper keepers back in the day. But they didn't action it. And so if you don't use feedback, it's meaningless. It's kind of like when I work with teachers and they say, okay, well, I checked for understanding. Okay, but did you respond to it? Right? So we got to go beyond the popsicle sticks. Like, what's the action beyond just receiving information? And so in that quote, what I'm saying is that there's so much more than planning to do something. It's actually taking action from that. So a student might take the feedback, and this is where habit 2 comes in, actually, where it's, can I navigate challenge by separating my identity from the ideas that someone's giving me? So if Steve gives, if you mark my paper about my understanding of Reconstruction, do I interpret that as Steve doesn't like me? Or given this idea, I need to make this change? And people wrestle with that all the time, right? So to me, it's that idea of, can you separate those two, and then can you take action from it? If you take action from it, that could double the rate of learning. But I think we lose that. I think it's like, well, I gave great feedback, but they didn't learn anything. Well, yeah, they didn't do anything, right? And so so we got to look to see, like, did they actually take the action? And that's like going back to chapter 2, like, that's what it's about. Like, pick something that's doable for you and the kids. You're like, that would work, but then take the action. Don't just go plan it. Go move. And it's unbelievable how many times I hear from people, great idea. What about the follow through? Didn't do it, right? The rocket science of education, in my opinion, it's about consistency of small doable practices. James Clear said, we never rise to our goals. We fall to our systems. Everybody's got a New Year's resolution, January 1. But as you and I are talking right now at the eve of February, right? Like, are we still doing it? And to me, the only people that are doing it is that they have those small doable actions. And so that's really what that quote meant.
I love it. It's awesome. And, so often my favorite thing actually was more in college when, as a history major, and you get your paper back and there's no feedback, right? You literally, it is good, not good, medium, something like this, whatever grade was given from on high. And, it's like, bleh. Nice.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's nothing you can do on that one.
Yeah. And
that's
so,
summative, right? Yeah.
And so not only is there nothing you can do about it, it's the same, it's the way, so the kid brain kicks in and says, well, yeah, so I guess there's nothing to look at here. I don't care what they marked on there and stuff like this. And so if we go back into school, into, the K through 12, or, it's one of the things it's so important that I think people remember that there's got to be something that they can take some action on, instead of, just, look at that and I'm going to stick it in my book bag. All right. So.
Right. And that's a habit, right? See, like, and I think that's where it goes back to the focus of the teacher. I think there's to say, how do I get students to action this? And not, did I give them the right feedback? Or like, is it perfect? It's like, yeah, I'm sure your feedback's great. Don't harp on that. Think about, once the student gets this, what are they going to go do with it? Because the kid's habit is put it away, don't worry about it, or stress about it and say, oh, I'm not good. It's like, no, I need you to go and take some action on this right now. So I'm going to give this back to you, and I want you to take some level of action. That's why like a routine I use in the book is I call it's called the DOT strategy. It's basically like, so Steve, you give me my paperback on Reconstruction, and it just has a dot on one of the paragraphs, and you say, hey, Michael, that dot means you either did something really well or something you need to fix. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to figure that out. Well, so now I need to action. Like, I can't just like, oh, Steve did all the work, I get to watch him work. It's, ooh, is this right? Is this wrong? So it's like, I look at the rubric, I talk to my peers, I scan it. I'm like, ooh, I could have made that change. And then you're like, all right, Michael, yeah, you made that change. You action this. And, then we can talk about grading and what all that means, but it's putting me into action, and you're still working too. Like, it wasn't like you weren't working, but the work is a little different because you set it up in a way where it puts me into action, as opposed to being like, I'll just watch you work. Because kids do not complain watching adults work most of the time. They're like, yeah, you go ahead, you do your thing. I'll sit back here. I'm gonna watch you do your thing. And so there we are, actioning, and students are in motion. And we've got to break that habit to be like, no, 2 to tango here.
I love it. It's it's like Tom getting Huck to paint the fence for him. It's like you go right.
Totally. Yes.
It's like you go right ahead there.
Yeah, go right ahead. I'll eat my apple. Yeah.
Exactly. Good stuff. All right, so a formatting part that I have to make sure that I bring out, because there's a whole bunch of good stuff here that I had to make sure I fit it in, because you have, throughout the book, you have included all these reproducibles, and my favorite are the reflection questions, but you have a bunch of others too. But let's talk about the reflection questions. What will the reader accomplish by not skipping this part in each chapter? Because you're not supposed to, when you get to that, go, oh, I can skip over this.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. I mean, to me, when you go into the other chapters, so when you look at things like, especially those chapters around deep to transfer, these are very rare in classrooms. So to me, it's going to those reflective questions and taking a good hard look, appraisal of your own practice and saying, am I doing those things? And are students doing those things? So it's, and is my team doing those types of things, right? So the reflective questions are really a place to pause and say, look, I need you to put yourself into this book with me and say, okay, are you running this? Now, look, when I was teaching, I wasn't doing this all the time. And there were certain places, like when I write, of course, you always figure this out after, you always look back and you're like, oh, if I would have known what I know now. The reflective questions are a way to say, okay, am I engaging in those practices? And what could I do to maybe put these things and make them in small and doable ways? And what I try to do within all of the reflective questions is kind of bring that chapter 2 back in. Would this be small and doable for you? Could you bring this in? Could you see yourself trying this tomorrow within a particular classroom that would be small and doable for you? And that's where those reflective questions, in my opinion, can be powerful. And, obviously, if I didn't think they would be helpful in bringing the reader into, their own space, I would have just not done it. Just been like, don't worry about it. Just listen to me pontificate and you go on with your life.
Nice. I like that. Cool. And I mean, they are powerful. I mean, I enjoyed reading through them, and the whole idea of stopping to think about what you just read and how you could use it in your classroom, how you could change what your practices are, something like that is, I think it just creates the ability to take action in the reader. So I love it. Chapter 4 introduces us to the importance of surface learning. In the beginning of this segment, you say, the degree to which students learn at the surface level is related to the specific approaches teachers deploy in the classroom. Talk about why this is important information for a teacher to understand.
Sure. There was a study that was done, Hattie and Donahue, in 2016. And what they looked at is they looked at specific strategies that help students at these different types of learning, at surface and deep and at transfer. And what they found is that, well, certain strategies work better at surface than they do at deep, than they do at transfer. So it's kind of this Kenny Rogers model. Like, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. So like every instructional practice has power somewhere, but where does it have that power? And so in that chapter and in that particular quote, essentially what I'm saying is, when you're trying to help students develop this surface level understanding, so they're just learning something brand new for the first time. They're building some factual understanding around a discipline or some procedures that they might be learning in like a lab or in mathematics. That there are certain strategies that seem to have a really high effect size here. Use them here, right? So this wouldn't be a place to bring in deep or transfer strategies at surface. It's to use those practices that have an intentional, focused impact at that particular type of learning. And that really goes through those next 2 chapters, right? So like explicit direct instruction, huge effect size at surface. Significant direct modeling, significant at surface. Not so much a transfer. So it's a good tool. Use that at surface, but then set that tool down and then be able to move to deep and transfer and pick something else up. Because I think so many times, Steve, and this is what I was trying to be intentional about, we tie a method or a pedagogy to our identity. We're like, oh, well, I do direct instruction. Oh, I'm a project-based learning teacher. It's like, well, why don't we think of it more of, I'm here to impact students and they're at this type of learning. So this practice, which happens to be direct instruction, I'll use here. And when I'm at this type of learning, maybe I'll use problem-based learning, and that the pedagogy isn't tied to my identity, it's my impact.
I love it. this fits right with what I'm getting ready to talk about next, which is, your book, Rigor Redefined, is so cool because it's filled with tools, actions, and activities that a teacher could learn and use. And I think that one of the things that has to happen is that sometimes we have to lead to water, lead to the, basically have a way.
Oh, yeah, I know that one. I'm a parent.
There you go. Oh yeah, there you go. And because we have to be able to say, for example, here you go. You could use these in your classroom. So talk about why you took time to include these.
These different practices?
Yes. And I know I could be specific, but there's lots of them. So I just thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Steve. The practices that I specifically selected in this book, I put these in the book because I've seen them. And when I've I've seen teachers use these. And when I asked them, did that take a lot of time for you to prepare? The answer was no. And did you find an impact on student learning in terms of assessment data? Right. So we saw an improvement in test scores. We saw an improvement in the quality of writing, in the quality of discussion. Or if in the case of dispositions, did we see that students started to change their level of recognition of where they were in their learning, or their ability to engage in homework, things of that nature? And what we found is that, yes. So to me, it was like, is this impactful? Is this doable? And so those are the practices in the book. So when I wrote this and I said, look, here are some simple steps, that's what I used. So it was based on what I've seen in the field and looking at qualitative and quantitative data in the field, but all of them are linked to substantial levels of research that we would see from academia, and saying, okay, let's tie those two things within the context of, can I do this in the busyness of my life as a teacher? Right. I mean, it's, it's just constant, right? There's tons of things going on from start to finish. And if I'm going to make a change, it's got to be 1%. Here's the little change. And that I could link in surface, deep, and transfer on a Monday. I don't have to think it's transfer Thursdays, right? Like this is the way of thinking about how to redefine rigor. So it's not like I've got to do surface for quarter one, maybe get to quarter two, but I won't be doing it for my students that are not in my honors class. They won't get it till they're quarter three. But to say, look, everybody gets a part of this. It might only be a little bit of an exposure to it, but you're going to get it every day.
Yeah, it's awesome and I love the fact that you're talking about seeing teachers use and work with and these tools and so forth, because that's so important. They know that these are. It's not like you just kind of made these up in a test tube or something like that. It's like this is real, right? This is powerful and impactful. So good stuff. Chapter 5, developing the habits of deep learning. Early in this section, you say this: students must develop the ability to make connections and identify patterns of knowledge, and then apply that knowledge to solve problems with others that often have differing perspectives and ideas. All right, you got to share what you're focused on here, because I love this.
That's a lot. Yeah. I think this is the most important chapter. And I think the reason why I say that is because of two things. One, almost every single standard in the world, when you look at, a standard for reading or for history or for science, mathematics, it's about relationships. It's about relating two or more ideas. And it's about taking ideas and then being able to make claims, to find evidence, to make reasoning, to argue, to look at different perspectives. It's always about relating two or more ideas in some way, shape, or form. That's where our standards sit. And what research has found is that expert teachers spend about 70% of their time engaging in deep learning. And then the other 30% of their time is usually at surface, maybe a little transfer sprinkled in. Experienced teachers spend about 70% of their time at surface, and only about 20 to 30% of their time at deep, which means that if you have an experienced teacher that's not an expert, you are getting a lot of surface and not a lot of standard level work. You're just not developing the habits that are necessary for what you're going to be assessed on, which is at that deep level. So that quote, and really what the chapter is about, is, look, students have to students have to engage in making connections with ideas. And that is analysis, to break apart, synthesis, to put together, evaluation, like what's the pattern that we can see through this particular work. And what Hattie and Donahue found is that it's really based on kids having classroom discussions, seeking help from peers, and being able to evaluate and reflect. And so everything in that chapter is, so if that's the case, here are some practices you could use that are small and doable. And so a lot of that chapter is focusing on, can we get students to build the sentence right when they talk? Can they speak and relate to ideas? Then we move to paragraph, and then we move to kind of the essay form, all in reading, writing, and talking, right? And so that chapter is really about that whole idea, and that's really where that quote comes from. That there's a lot in that quote, but that's really kind of the gist of it.
It's so, when you think about deep learning, I think that, because I've had people say, oh yeah, I do that. And then you visit them in their classroom, and you're like, yeah, really? Okay. Yeah. It's deep learning had to do with where they sat in the classroom or something. I think that, this concept of surface, and then deep learning, and then what we're getting ready to talk about in transfer learning, I think at some point we need to, in education, really spend a lot of time understanding what that is, because too often what happens is that some training's been introduced to them about why they should do this, and it becomes, Michael made me do this, or Steve, I'm doing it because Steve wants me to do this. And it's like, no, what are you thinking? This is not because Steve made you do this, or it's the right thing to do. I mean,
I agree, Steve. And sometimes I think these words become too conceptual, right? It's like, and then it becomes scary. It's like deep space, and it's like, deep learning, like this sounds awful. Or it's like, you've got to do a 3-day prep for a big dialogue, a Socratic seminar. And then you go in, and as a teacher, you're like, this is pretty flat. Like, it felt pretty flat. Like, the students didn't speak at this complex level. It's like, yeah, but they didn't build the habits that are small and concrete. Like, there's an example in the book where I just talk about, can you get students to take two ideas, two concepts we might be relating, and can you use because, but, so, and form a sentence using these conjunctions? So like last night, I'm teaching my daughter about cell reproduction. So she's learning about mitosis and meiosis. And I'm like, can you form a sentence with mitosis and meiosis, add the academic word cell division, and use because, but, so? So, mitosis is related to meiosis because they're both forms of cell division, but meiosis is with sex cells and mitosis is with autosomal cells. So both form new cells, but one is haploid and one is diploid, or something like that, right? So, but her having to work through that's 3 sentences, Dave, right? Using conjunctions, that's deep learning. And the more we can make it that concrete, we can shrink the change, and a teacher can look at it and be like, oh, I can do that. Yeah, and so can your kids. And if you can do that every day, you got deep learning. Boom, boom, boom. And then you can do a Socratic seminar, that big event, but it just doesn't have to be this big conceptual thing. Because I think if I was like, deep learning staff, they'd be like, come on, let's go home. Can we talk about why the juniors left early for lunch? Like that's way better than this thing. Anyway.
Been there. That's for sure. It's like,
yeah, totally.
Sorry, that's funny. By the way, I got to say, you have some incredible dinner conversations there.
I don't know if my daughter would say that. I don't know if she thinks that's a great conversation, but my kids definitely think twice before asking me for help. When they're like, hey, Dad, can you help? I'm like, sure. And they're like, why are you putting a dot on my homework, Dad?
Nice. That's funny. Anyway. Both my sons became engineers, and my wife was is a mathematician and worked in the corporate world of that type of stuff. And so the funny thing is when Dad would say things like, "Hey, I can help you with that." Yeah, the historian. Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, and they still say things like that to me. It's like, cut it out, man. Anyway.
Oh yeah, it's great.
Gotta love kids. All right, so let's talk about transfer learning. In Chapter 6, Developing Transfer Learning Habits, you note this: Transfer learning is focused on applying knowledge across different situations, using that knowledge to solve in-depth problems and refining solutions to those problems over time. I love this. Why does a teacher need to understand it?
I think ultimately we want students to transfer. I think we want them to take the things that we're teaching them and to see how those apply to situations today in the real world. When you look at, and to be more pragmatic, I think that what is a state test? Well, it's a transfer task. It's taking what I've just taught them. So if I've taught them something about cellular respiration of this organism, and then they get on a test, and this test has a different organism, can they transfer that? Can they take, oh, well, this is the same thing over here. It's just a different context that I'm looking at. Transfer is, by and large, about breadth. It's not learning more content as much as it is about seeing what I've learned and can I apply this into a new situation and then understand that situation, then be able to solve a complex problem with it. And so transfer is something that we don't see often in schools. We haven't built the muscle or the habits around transfer. And again, I think going back to deep learning, I think it's because we think it takes too much time. We have to do a 3-week project. And it's just not true. There's really simple things we can use using analogies and metaphors as a really simple strategy that we could do each day. Or I don't know if you remember those old highlight magazines where they had to spot the difference and they had like the two, and you're just saying, oh, well, this one's a little bit different because the leaf is tilted, or this one, he's missing the hat. And, but that's transfer. That's just saying, how is this situation similar and different? And then, and then talking through that difference, that's all transfer is. And so in that book or in that chapter, that's what I'm talking about. Look, transfer is different from surface and deep in that it's about breadth. It's about seeing across contexts as opposed to content. And then saying, can I see those differences? And then in that situation, if I was to give you a problem, could you say, okay, well, now I can solve it given what I've collected from surface and deep? That's really what that chapter is all about.
And I love that. And by the way, what I left out of my story before is what I was setting up for this part, which is what they did not know is that I was able to show them where they could find some help and assistance with that math problem they were stuck on through this thing, this teacher's YouTube channel that I found. And I said, look at this. I said, and so in now you have to know I had a whole, I was on a mission. I'm going to find some way where I could say, the history teacher did help you, didn't he? But
that's right.
I was able to take something that someone else was showing, and I realized this is where they are right now. And I think that when we, there's so many different aspects in our world that transfer of learning is so important that, when a kid asks you, why do I need to know this? Well, it is going to pay off for at some point you're going to pull the rabbit out of your hat. We're going to make this happen. I love the idea of transferring learning.
And I think, it's interesting. From a lot of the research, we find that experts really struggle with transfer. Kindergartners are great at transfer. Kindergartners see connections everywhere. But what happens is that as we learn content, we kind of create these blinders, and these blinders kind of shut us into certain disciplines. And then what happens is when we give them something that's just a little bit outside of their view, they don't see the application, they don't see the transfer. And all we're trying to do is put a little WD-40 on those blinders and kind of open it up and be like, oh, I see the connection. And so those practices in the book are just like, here's little things that you can do to just kind of make that WD-40 and kind of get them back to what they probably felt like when they were kindergartners. And that's when you see experts that are in, researchers call it flow and serious play. Well, those are experts that they can hone in on the knowledge of surface and deep, and then they can go out broad and say, how does this connect across different fields? And that's really the magic of transfer. If we can just do that a little bit, sprinkle that in each day and just build that muscle over time, it's like an investment. And you're just, over time, it just builds and builds and builds. Kids will have the transfer level habits they need.
That's so cool. One of the things I used to coach young kids through high school kids eventually as a soccer coach, right? And one of the cool things about little kids is that you're working with them where they still have the concrete concept of, I get the ball, it's mine. And then you have to work with them on learning that, no, this is a game of share the ball, but not with the ones that aren't dressed like you. That's the other team. So, and then as you teach them how to use some of the skills, you have to teach them how to transfer it to the situation so that when there is a goalie in front of that goal, you can figure out how to pass it. You share the ball, you pass it, and either it's passed back to you and you score, or the other teammate scores. And you don't keep the ball from your teammates because that's your ball. But I think it shows a lot in soccer, the development of being able to share and use the situation to be able to transfer what you've been taught about certain skills. And it's, not to pick on a sport, but I mean, there's so many different other ways. But I think it really shows when you watch little kids learning how to do a activity or a game like that.
Absolutely. And I think that's the power of thinking about rigor as a taxonomy, because I would assume, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, as you were coaching, you probably went across all three of those experiences, right? So understanding how to do this work individually, understanding how to work with each other, understanding the strategy of the game. You didn't say, well, until you completely understand that, about your own self-world, we can't move to sharing the ball, right? You were mixing those and saying, okay, I need us to be intentionally focused. And I would imagine in college and in professional soccer, you're still doing those things. You're going across surface deep and that transfer. And to me, that's the power of learning, and not thinking, oh, I've got to get all the surface done before I can ever get to deep, before I can ever get to transfer.
So much so. So cool. All right, we're getting close to finishing up, Michael. And where can our listeners find additional information, connect, and learn more?
Well, thanks, Steve. One, you can get the book. You can get the book really anywhere. It's published through Solution Tree. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it through Barnes and Noble. You can, or your local bookstore, I'm sure, if you ask them for it. And then I'm on LinkedIn. That's the only social media that I use these days. And you just type in my name, Michael McDowell, and my organization is hingeeducation.org, and you can go there. And I do a lot of work with Core Collaborative as well. And if you connect with any of us there, I would love to jump on a call and talk through the book.
Awesome. And I'll put that information in the show notes so it's easy for them to find and connect with you. One last question, and it goes like this.
Yeah.
Michael, do you have a teacher in your past who made a difference in your life? If so, who was it? And what would you say if given the chance to say thank you?
Can I do two, Steve? Is
Sure.
that okay? All right. So there's two. Miss Webb, she was my librarian when I was in elementary school. I really struggled with reading. I was dyslexic when I was younger. But she just saw right through that and was like, I got you. And she also always found great books for me. And then I have a professor in college who taught organic chemistry. Her name was Dr. Murray. And she was just the best teacher. I mean, I think a lot of people feared her. And I mean, she was pretty tough. But she was also like, I got you anytime you need support. And she was just always there. And those are two that just always stand out to me.
Very cool. Appreciate you sharing. That's awesome. Michael, thank you so much for talking with us about your book, Rigor Redefined, 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. Awesome focus, powerful tools for helping the classroom teacher develop rigorous learning in their classrooms. Wishing the best in all you do.
Thanks, Steve.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.